Hello, my name is Tim Burridge. I just thought I would share with you a recent project of mine. I think I named it Mediterranean Cave Study or something. Basically, I just for a personal test, I created a ArcViz style um, still rendering of a natural cave with a pool inside it. I got this inspiration from a website. It's just an image of a resort pool in Mykonos. And I just loved the way that the light, indirect light, illuminated the inside of this white cave just by bouncing off the floor and around and everything. So I set out to just play around with it, and I was really quite happy with the results, and I learnt a lot doing it as well. So I thought I would share that with you. I'll be posting this video and how I created it as text form on the BlenderArtist forum. However, I have already shared this project on the CGSociety forum under critiques. I'll put a link in the description. And I received some great suggestions on how to improve it in little bits that like negative space and silhouetting that I could have just things that I didn't see when I was doing the project. So as you can see, the renders are sliding on by. This was rendered in Cycles, Blender 2.71, I think, with the integrated preset of full global illumination, meaning a maximum bounces of 128 and 128 for diffuse, 128 for glossy, and 128 for transmission. I did enable no caustics, just because that was giving me interference. Cycles doesn't really handle caustics too well, so I kind of try to fake that in post. Basically, what I did was I rendered out the scene at 2 times 1920 by 1396, which ended up being a resolution of 3840 by 2792. At first it was just the one render, but as things progressed, I wanted to get the shot from different angles. As you can see on this work in progress, I didn't have that sculpture up the top to begin with, and the scene kind of looked a bit empty and lacked a bit of interest. So I ended up doing a pre-visualization of this sculpture, and I really liked the way it rendered out and looked. So I added that to the composition, and it ended up really working nicely. So polygon wise, I think render time I had something like what's that, 2 million or above. Not too heavy on the polygons. A lot of the modeling was done, especially for the cave mesh, was done with a really basic mesh, and then I used a multi-resolution modifier and added 7 subdivision levels of Catmull Clark, and then I used I think a cloud and a noise, I think noise and a cloud texture to displace the geometry to make it look like it was the kind of not so much wavy, but distorted look of the inside of the cave. Lighting wise, it was really simple. I just used the default Blender sky texture, Hosek and Wilkie, and then a single sun lamp, I was getting all my lighting from just the indirect bouncing of that single sun lamp, and it really ended up working quite nicely. I wanted to keep everything 32-bit high dynamic range renders. So I rendered out as EXRs, and I rendered out a number of different passes per EXR, which was, let me just open, direct, indirect, and color for the diffuse, and then the same for glossy and transmission. No subsurface, because I wasn't using subsurface scattering. And then I mixed all that together in, I was going to do an After Effects, but a lot of the effects like noise reduction and lens blur and stuff it's not fully supported in 32-bit editing in After Effects. So I did all this in Nuke, and as you can see in this image, the Nuke script, I think they call it, node layout, was really quite simple. Just mixing diffuse, glossy, and translucent node groups, adding an alpha, adding in the sculpture, adding Z depth as that was rendered out, and then I was really surprised by how much I had to soften the 4K image to make it look photographic and not computer generated. I really had to, like, by a factor of 2 or something, and it was kind of counterintuitive, because I really didn't want to soften it. I wanted to preserve all the details, because naturally you don't want to make something worse. But in softening it, it really gave the composition of the image an illusion of being captured with our current technology, rather than generated on the computer. Nuke's Z defocused node worked really well with the Z depth buffer in giving a slight depth of field. Because this is a architectural image, architectural visualization image, I didn't want to give it too strong of a depth of field, because generally images of buildings and landscapes are taken at a very wide depth of field on a higher aperture, and with the focal distance probably at infinity or close to that. I did end up adding chromatic aberration, which I really liked. Added a lot to the composition, a lot to the final image, in that I had a lot of strong lighting coming onto the lens, and the chromatic aberration really helped. That was actually quite simple. I just used a scale node, and I split the image into the RGB channels and then scaled them slightly differently, then recombined. I didn't add any noise because this was rendered in cycles at around 600 samples. Because I was rendering out at 4K, the noise was less visible in that, because it was such a high resolution image, the noise itself was very fine. So 600 samples tend to work okay. And also when I ended up, now that when the final 32-bit image was composited out of Nuke, I then took that into Luminance HDR, and in that program I treated the rendered output as if it was a photograph that I had taken with my DSLR HDR photograph. So Luminance HDR is like Pictonaut or Photomatrix Pro, in that it's a high dynamic range processing and tone mapping application. And what I did with that program was I tone mapped the image, the high dynamic range image, I think under Nuke 06 tone mapping option. And that kind of brought out the noise a bit, but also brought out a lot of the detail in the image. And gave it a slightly different look. I used that process for all images, and then I opened that final. I saved it out as a 16-bit TIFF, and then I opened up that final medium dynamic range image in Photoshop, and then did further post processing, like slightly more color correcting. I think I added a bit of blur here and there. I played around with the dodge and burn tool, just to add some contrast here and there, and I think some clouds in the background that weren't rendered. It was just a gradient sky rendered out of the 3D application, and just stuff like that. Basic color correction, and then saved that out as lower resolution JPEGs for upload to the web. As far as the Blender scene goes, I did find that rendering in cycles at a full global illumination preset, it did take a long time. At 4K resolution, it took about, I think, 2 hours. For the nighttime scene, I was rendering at limited global illumination because I only had interior lights. And I rendered that in, I think, half an hour at 4K. But the daytime scenes were all around 2 to 4 hours. So if I was rendering that as an animation, even at 1920 by 1080, you'd still be looking at a long time per frame. So some optimizations would probably be needed. I think the whole idea of this project was to not be worried about polygon limits, and just to put in as much detail as possible and then strive for something as photorealistic as possible. I'll be uploading some more videos soon. At the moment, I'm working on a really cool project for a post-production at university. Motion tracking in SynthEyes and a bit of Maya. And hopefully that'll end up really nice. So I'll be uploading that when that's finished as well. Thank you.